Hello and welcome to another Developer Essentials. So this time around we're going to be taking a look at Unity events. Now we've actually, if you've looked at things like the video for user interfaces, we've actually already started using Unity events a bit. So we're going to take a look at a couple of things with this. And first we'll take a look at things from the actual sort of using existing events side, and then we'll also take a look at things from the point of view of, okay, well, what if we want to create our own Unity events, and how we sort of decide where we want to set things up. So Unity events are a really great way of having two systems communicate, but it's being able to configure that communication in the inspector. So we're not hard coding it in, we're actually setting it up as data, as information, as part of our level. So what I'm going to do just initially is I'm going to demonstrate a couple of Unity events using ones that don't take any inputs, and also then ones that do take inputs, and seeing sort of the different ways that we can work with those. So what I'm going to do is, for this, I'm actually going to create a basic UI, and I'm going to have some controls. Now I'm going to make this UI following my normal sort of approach, having the scaling be with screen size, and going for my preferred resolution for designing these things of 1920 by 1080. And then we're just going to have this be over to the side, that, and height, probably 400 as well for the height. And then I just want to position this so that it's at the top there like that. Cool. So let's chuck in a couple of controls. So I want to illustrate something where there is no user input in terms of additional values, that it's just a yes, this thing has happened type of event. Now this time around, I've previously used the Text Mesh Pro versions. I'm going to just use the regular version because we'll actually see with the regular version the scaling does not happen as nicely as we would potentially like it to for the text. So these, I'm going to do the thing of a vertical layout group, not force expanding height, but I will force expand on width. So all this is going to be is send demo event, no data. Let's make that a larger size so it's a bit easier to read. There we go. So this is send demo event button. So okay, we've got that. We're also going to add in a slider. So we have something where we've got a bit of a variable range of data that's able to come through. So we've got values associated with the thing. So we're not just sending, hey, this thing's happened. We're saying, hey, this thing's happened, and here's a bit of information about it. So this is data and a slider. I'm going to make this a little bit larger in height as well. Let's make that more like 40. Just makes it a little bit easier to see, and put in a bit of spacing and a bit of padding, just make it look a little bit neater. So the slider here currently has a 0 to 1 range, and that's fine. Okay, we need to have something that can receive the values from this. So let's set up our scripts folder, and let's have a script, and this is going to be demo event handler 1, because I feel like we might have multiple of these. So this will just be our demo event handler, and I'm just going to, in this case, I think this can go onto the controls one. I think is a reasonable one for this to go onto. So we can see, if we look at our demo event button, And this is how events will typically look when they're set up in the inspector. So they'll usually be on and then a verb. So on click, if we look at the event slider, on value changed. And if there's anything in the parentheses, then it means that it has that as a actual value it can send through. With the demo event button, the parentheses are empty, so it's not actually sending any info through. But this convention of it being on and then a verb is what you'll typically see. So for us to link to the events here, we need to have these functions be public. So I'm going to have one function here that is going to be onClick event, no data. And there's a very particular reason why I'm putting no data there as part of this name. So the name for this doesn't actually matter to the event system. The name of this is purely for our usage. So a public void onClick event no data. But I'm also going to set up one that simple data. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that this could maybe take in a message, just so we can see what happens, because we know the event isn't trying to send through any data, but can we bind that event to something that does take through data? So let's find out. So it'll need to recompile the code. That's a normal thing we'll run into. Because the nice thing with how these events work is multiple things can be linked to it. What we would say is there are multiple listeners. So the things that consume an event, the things that react to it, are referred to as listeners for that event. So we need to link up the object here. So in this case, I'm linking it to the controls. And then when I have done that, when I click here on no function, I've got a list of all the different scripts that are attached to it. So I can actually interact with those scripts and those variables. If I go to my demo event handler, well, I can see both of the onClick event ones actually appear. So let's link this one to onClick event no data. Let's see what happens if I link this one to onClick event simple data. We can see I get a blank field here. Test message. So I can link to that. I wonder if I can link to having something that's a bit more complicated again. Let's call it less simple data. What if I have, there's a message and also a value. So let's see what it does if I put like a that there. Can I link to something that has multiple parameters? So we'll find out. We can add in another one, link up our controls, and demo event handler, and we can see it doesn't actually appear. So we can link to something that has a single parameter, but we can't link to something that has multiple parameters there. At least we can't do that via the inspector. There are a bunch of things that we aren't able to do within the inspector that we would actually normally be able to do via code. And we'll take a look and see how we can actually do that in code as well. But for now, let's just test what happens with this. I'm going to get rid of that one. And let's see what happens when I click on Send Demo Event. Because what I am hoping to see is that I have two messages logged out, and one of them containing that text test message. So it works. So, okay, cool. So we can link this to something that takes no values. We can link it to something that takes multiple values. That's handy. Well, okay, before we come back and try and link it to things that can take multiple, let's have a look at our slider. So our slider has a single. So single is another term you'll hear used. It refers to a float. So single as in single precision floating point number, whereas then the one with more precision is referred to as a double. So single is the same as a float. So we know that void on value changed event, I'm just going to call it on changed event. So we know that we should absolutely be able to link to one where it takes a floating point value. We know that much. So we can say on changed event. I'm going to put in a single float. So I'm going to put it like that. So we know that should work. What if we have one that doesn't take a parameter? Can we link one where the event says, no, I've got data, to something that doesn't have data? So, okay, no data. Let's see if we can link to that. And as a final one, well, we couldn't do this when it took one parameter. That couldn't work. What if we have one where on changed event multiple parameters? So we'll make the first one the new value, and let's just throw in a string. Let's see if that is able to work and the different ways that we can work with that potentially. So multiple parameters, output the message, and then we output the new value. So let's see which of these we can link to with this, because again, we can link to multiple things, so we can test multiple in one go. So okay, we again link in our controls. We again go down to demo event handler. So we can see a couple of things here. So we can see on changed event, our no data and our single float ones appear down here. The one with multiple parameters doesn't. So that is still not appearing as something we can link up in the inspector. But we also see we have an entry up here and it's under dynamic float. And so we have dynamic versus static. So let's take a look and see what happens if we link to these different ones. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually just link to all of these. So we'll link our controls up, got demo event handler, and we will link that to the single float one. We'll see that asks me to pass through a value. I'm going to make that 0.25. And then we're going to bring our controls in. And we're going to link to this one. So we've linked to all three ones that exist there. So let's just run this and let's see what happens. Let's see what messages we actually receive. So I'm going to just jump this to a particular point by clicking on it. So we can see the no data one ran. We can see that the 0.25, so when we use the one that was under the static section where we provide a value, then that exact value came through. Whereas the dynamic one gives me the value based upon where I've clicked. So generally when we're using this with user interfaces, we would use the dynamic one so that we're actually getting through the values as they change. So static ones are for when you want to set and control in the inspector what value gets passed through. Whereas dynamic allows the emitter of the event to pass data through. And we'll actually be seeing later on how we emit events and how we can provide particular values there for it. So static, we configure in the inspector the data. Dynamic, the emitter of the event configures the data. So we can see it can handle if data is missing. That's completely fine. but we couldn't bind to these ones where there was multiple parameters. So that's okay. We can take a look at some ways of how we can actually do that. So firstly, what I'm going to need here is Unity Engine UI. So I'm going to need to be able to access the slider and the button. So this is the demo button. Demo slider. So we're going to see how we can actually bind to these events. So it's a process where if we go demo button, and then what we'll be able to see is we know this thing was called click. So if we put on click, we can see, okay, there is on click. And then we can do add listener. So this allows us to, in code, have something subscribe to this event or start listening to that event. So really handy at times for, we might have systems where we don't actually want to configure it in the inspector, where we just want it to happen at runtime. In particular, this is something where if we have an object that we are instantiating at runtime, so we're spawning something into the level, in the inspector, we can't actually hook up what it's connected to because that prefab can only refer to things inside itself. So if, say, we have a character spawning in the level and it needs to, register with a squad leader and it needs to be able to send information to it, things like that, that has to happen in code at runtime. So we can't build that into the prefab because the other objects it's trying to refer to don't exist at that point. So using things like add listener is a way that we can actually set that up in code. So really, really handy. And so we can very easily bind to things where, okay, what we could do on click event, no data. We're already subscribed to it. So it's very straightforward. So that's straightforward if we're doing like of that. What if we do the simple data one? Let's see what happens with that. We've put simple data, and that one, it's going to be getting grumpy at us because it doesn't match the exact pattern. So with the add listener one, if you're trying to link to something, it's going to expect it to be the exact pattern. Similar with the demo slider, so on value changed, add listener. If we tried to add the no data one, then that's not matching the pattern because it's expecting a one that takes a float. So if the one we're trying to provide doesn't match, and we'd encounter that with the less simple data one, and we would encounter that with the multiple parameters one. So both of those, if we tried to actually bind to them like this, it's not going to work. But there is a way around it. So we can actually wrap our code here to be able to send this data through. So let's take a look at how we can do that little bit of wrapping to be able to interact with those more complicated ones. Okay, so what we have to use is something called a delegate, which is something that exists built into the C# language. So you'll also hear the concept of events as a pure C# implementation. So there's actually two types of events. There are Unity events that are designed for us being able to work within the inspector, and there are also C# events, which are a purely runtime code-based approach. So delegates are associated with it. So what we can do is we can say, okay, well, I'm going to have a delegate. And what this is going to do is I can put my code in here. So I'm going to link to on-click event, less simple data, and delegate message. And let's give it a value of 57.14. Because why not? So a delegate looks like that. It's a little snippet of code, could be multiple lines, but it's a way that we can bind this to having more complicated information sent through. So in this case, we would be able to send through its delegate. So you can use delegates if you're needing to bind an event to something that's more complicated. Really handy for being able to do that. And what we'll see when we run this is, let's get this running. We'll use send demo event first. So it's getting grumpy at me because one of the most common problems that you will run into, and that's the thing where you can assume that you will run into stuff like this where you forget to set things up in the inspector. I've been using Unity for a very long time and I still run into that error, including in the middle of a video. It's also happened in the middle of a class before. So I can do the send demo event and we can see it's now able to link to the less simple data one. We'll see the same thing for when I click on the slider. So that's how we can work with existing events. So this is all about working with existing events. What about setting up our own events? Well, we can do that. So what I am going to do is I'm going to set up another script here. So this is going to be demo event emitter. And I'm just going to put this on a empty game object, event emitter, drag this in. So what I want to be able to do is I want to demonstrate this process of being able to have a few different types of events. So ones that don't take any parameters, and then also ones that do take parameters. So for working with these, we generally want to add in Unity engine.events. That's just going to give us access to the key things that we need there. So, okay, let's set up for a simple case, I can have serialize field Unity event, and then we try and follow that same pattern of the variable name being on, and then a verb. So on something happened is a new Unity event. What we can then do is things will be able to be linked up to that. And so if I just go straight away to here, so event emitter, I can see immediately it appears, which means I can link this up to, in this case, going to link it up to the controls. And I'm going to say, what's going to use demo event handler, and it is going to use the on-click event that lets me display a message. We're displaying the message, but how do we actually activate that event? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a bool, and this is a common thing I'll do of having just the debug booleans. Send something happened. So how I would use something like this is I would say F. So as soon as that boolean is true, first thing I do is set it to false. Something happened requested. So if that happens, then what I do is the way I invoke these events, the way I run them, is I would say on something happened, invoke. Just like that. This invokes the event. Notifies all listeners of the event. So anything that's been added as a listener, either in the inspector or in code, will then react when this is sent. So if I run this, then we come here and we click the checkbox, then we get the event. So that's cool, that's working. Well, what if we want to have data with this though? What if we want to have extra information? Now we've seen certainly before, one of the things we can do is, okay, well, Unity event, maybe it passes in a float on float happened. Sure, why not? Unity event floats. Let's see if this works. We've created our event. Let's have another Boolean. Send float happened. So again, I'm just going to lift the setup from this. Why reinvent the wheel? So we close off that. We are going to invoke the onFloat happened one, and you'll see it gets grumpy at me because I need to be providing that floating point value. So I'm just going to pick a random number between 0 and 100. Okay, so let's see how that works. So we should get our event appearing here, and we do. So we can link that up to our controls, and then our demo event handler. So we can link that, and we see, because this sends for a float, we can now actually link to our dynamic one. So let's test this, and we want to make sure that works. So it's working. Now, if you've used older versions of Unity, or you are using an older version of Unity, this may not work. This is actually a newer thing letting you do that. Previously, what we had to do, and so I'll show you the older version. So what we would have to have done previously, and I'll demonstrate this with using a string. So we would normally have to do string event, and that is a Unity event string. So we would previously have had to do something like of this. So serialize field, string event on string happened is a new string event. So that's a change, and I just want to confirm that it's definitely going to allow me to test. Cool, so this is actually something that didn't used to previously work. We did have to go and use this old version. So if you're using newer Unity versions, then you're in luck. You're able to use this much neater syntax, which is good. That's actually a really positive change, and that's excellent to see. I'm going to really test it with a bit more of a complicated one, in that we saw we had ones here that took in a float and a string. So I'm going to test that in a moment, just because I want to be absolutely certain that it's working exactly the way that we need. Not that I'm skeptical. I mean, I am, but I want to be absolutely certain. So let's have another one that a Unity event, and we have ones here that were a string and then a float. So let's say string float on, let's call that on string float happened, new Unity event. Okay, that's looking really promising for it is going to handle even complex setups. Send string float happened, which that's really good. But if you are using an older version of Unity, you may need to go for the class-based approach. Um, that's just something to be aware of. And you might be having to use an older version of Unity because that's all that is installed or all that you're able to be using on a particular device, or because you've version locked for a project, and that's fine. The key thing there is we do have a way around this string float happened. Okay, so we've linked up to a bunch of extra ones, so we'll see these all appear here. And what we will see is on string happened. If we go to our controls, and then we go to demo event handler, we can see we do have some dynamic string ones. So I can go for the on-click event simple data. For the on-string float happened, because this was one that we couldn't previously bind to in the inspector. If we go to demo event handler, we can see we now can. So it is possible with our more complex Unity events to actually bind then to things that have multiple inputs there. So when we're working with events, we're not constrained where it's only one bit of data that it's sending. So let's just check that our send string works, which it does. And then let's check our send string float, which also works. So, okay, we've seen different ways of working with this. So key things here is you may need to use this syntax. I'm going to bring this onto one line because that fits more appropriately in older Unity versions. So this syntax may not be supported in the version of Unity that you are using. If it is not, then this is the approach for being able to set it up to send through more complex data. Key thing is you need to make sure you say that it is serializable. That's indicating that this is a class that is able to be saved and loaded, which will mean that you can set things up in the inspector, they'll be remembered, they'll get saved as part of the level or asset that you're working with. So it's really important there with that. So just recapping sort of the key things here with when we're setting up Unity events, we need to add in our events, Unity engine.events namespace. So we need that there so we have access to it. When we are setting up our own events, if we don't need any parameters, we just use an empty Unity event. We can, in more recent versions of Unity, directly in the angled brackets indicated the sequence of types that are taken in. In older versions of Unity, we can't use that syntax, and what we have to do is we have to create a new class that we must, absolutely must, mark as system.serializable. So this is for the old Unity versions, this is for new Unity versions. When we set these up, we can link them up in the inspector, same as we could with anything else. When we're linking things up in the inspector, dynamic versions mean the emitter of the event, or the invoker of the event, controls the data and provides the data through. If we are using the static versions, then we are sending through the data in terms of we configure it in the inspector when we link up the event. So dynamic, invoker sends data, static, we configure in the inspector the data. To activate the event, we just do invoke, and that will check to ensure that we are providing the right data of the right type through. So as we saw with things like the float, if we tried to put no data there, it would get cranky at us. Same with if we've got one that doesn't take data and we tried to provide data there, it will get grumpy at us. So we need to make sure that we are matching it, and it's giving us error checking with that. We can pass through multiple things in this way. And so we can pass through multiple bits of data, really handy for doing that. And then with the events, we can, for a lot of things, we can link things up in the inspector. So that's a common thing for stuff like user interfaces, areas like of that. We often would link those up in the inspector because they're talking to things that exist there. Because we can't link to something that's in another scene. So if I tried to set up, actually a good example is, so these controls here, the demo event button, that's linking to something on its parent. I'm just going to create a copy of this. So the copy, it preserves the link there. If I turn this into a prefab, then we'll see that prefab, it's actually severed the links there. And that's because you can't link. So a prefab can't link to anything outside of the prefab, in that we can't set that up in the inspector. Same thing, something in the scene can't link to something that isn't already in that scene. We can't set that up in the inspector. We can link things up at runtime though. So at runtime, we can add listeners in. That is something that is supported there. We can, if need be, also remove listeners. So if we look at listeners, we've got the option of being able to remove an individual listener. We could also remove all listeners from an object. If we need to do that, we have access to be able to do that also. So when we're linking things up in the inspector there, we can only do that to things that are within, if it's a prefab, things that are within that prefab. If it's something where we're linking to other things in the scene, has to be things that are already there in that scene at the editor time. Otherwise, we have to link up using stuff like add listener. And that allows us to connect to the particular things. Add listener, we can run into the issue with add listener where if we're wanting to send data that is different in terms of parameters. So if we're trying to link to something where it's expecting no data, but we want to send through data, or it's expecting a single floating point value and wanting to send through other things, we can wrap that call in a delegate, which will allow us to wrap that block of code, package that up, and add that as a listener. So that is a supported thing there that can be really handy in cases like of this. And we can use this for if there's small little bits of logic that we want to kick off for things. So events are a super powerful thing. They allow us to have objects communicate and convey things that are happening to other things. So, even just looking at if we look at a very simple example of, okay, maybe we have our ground here, and I'm going to set up some materials, because what I want to do is I just want to have something where it is going to, when something hits the ground, it's going to play a sound. We'll have it set up so it could play a sound. So material for the ground, can link that up. Just that. Got our ground. And then let's have the material for our ball. We'll create a sphere. I'm just going to position that 10 meters up in the air. Going to give it a rigid body so we know it will actually fall. And give that a material. That's good. Let's just color that also. Cool. So what we want then, that ball is going to have a script demo collision event. So we're going to make it react to when it is hit the ground. So it hitting the ground is going to be on collision enter, collision other. And what we're going to do using Unity engine events, going to have serialized field, Unity event on hit ground. And then what we would do is I'm going to say f other game object compare tag with ground. Then on hit ground, invoke. Send event if we hit the ground. Because this could then do a whole bunch of different things. But what I'll do initially is the ground here. We will add in a tag for ground and make sure it has that. Because we could have a central thing for emitting sounds and then it notifies that. We could also be setting up stuff so that it is, doing all manner of different things. So playing sounds, it could be ticking up a score, things like that. So in this case, I'm just going to link it up to the controls one, but we could link this up to playing audio. So I'm going to use the one that lets me send a string. So bounce. And just because I want this to bounce multiple times, is maths. So I'm going to actually set up some physics materials. So physics material is mat ground, and let's also have a physics material all just so we've got these each able to be configured. And then what I'm going to do is, okay, the bounciness there, let's make that 0.25, and it's similar for the ground. And then let's just see what happens. Let it run, and it'll fall, we get bounce. So every time it activates, we get that event. So as we can see, we can really easily just link that up to something that was playing a sound, that was accumulating a score, that was causing all manner of different effects there quite easily. So Unity events are a really great way of being able to link things up. Now we could directly link that up in code. The ball could directly talk to a score script or directly talk to an audio script. It could do that. I prefer setting things up in the inspector because it allows me more flexibility. Because it means, okay, well, I might set it up that it's now talking to and playing sound, but then I might later on decide, okay, no, actually, I want it to play a score, update the score, and I want to kick off this visual effect, and I want it to do this other thing. So when you have multiple things that it's then needing to do, if you're able to just come into the inspector and go, oh, okay, link this up, do this, do this, do this, it's really easy. Because in the case of this one, say I was linking that up to audio, I could have an audio source here, and I could link this to the audio source. I could go audio source, and then I can go play one shot, and I could just link the audio clip up here. So I've written no extra code, and it's then able to be playing an audio file. I could do similar for kicking off animations, things like that. Makes it really easy for linking up additional effects to things. So events are all about having our objects in our world react to things and being able to really easily configure that in the inspector. So that's stuff where, with this, some things you might want to experiment with. Grab the stuff from the audio video, bring those in, and then link up sound effects onto this. Grab stuff from the user interface video, set up stuff where you have scores being updated. So you could very easily start to link together different bits and pieces there to have this be doing more complicated things. So dive in, experiment with it, see the kinds of cool things you can create with it. And yeah, that's the big thing. Experiment, see what you can make with it. Thanks, folks. If you're looking for the code for the project, then in the description below, you'll find a link to the GitHub. And on the GitHub, I've got the code for this project and for all of the other projects there freely available. And if you have found the video helpful and you'd like to support the channel, then throwing in a like or subscribing is always a huge help. If you're looking for further ways to support, then I do have a Patreon set up, and that's going to help me keep managing to do these videos for a long time to come, which is going to help more people make cool things. And that's awesome, because that's what this is all about, is helping more people make more cool things. And that is all. Thank you.